When it comes to migration, Australia went from, "This place is empty, we need people," to, "Let's kick migrants out of the country." And when that didn't work, they went back to, "Come on back, we need you again." Let me tell you a quick story of why Australia went through these mood swings and what ultimately made Australia realize that with no people, they'd be doomed. I'm not an Aussie, but I know a thing or two about the land down under. Back in the 1800s, after the Brits colonized Australia, millions of people arrived in this untouched land with promises of a new great life. From convicts and pioneers to scientists and gold hunters, Australia grew at a cracking pace. But 100 years later, in the 1900s, Australia had a change of heart. They decided it was time to slam the brakes on migrants and make Australia an exclusive white-only club. The government slapped on the White Australia policy and put a stop to migration for anyone without European or white backgrounds. It drastically became one of the most racist countries in the world. Thousands who had put down roots, built homes, married, and had children were all of a sudden kicked out of the country just for not fitting the White Australia mold. Australia deported so many migrants, especially from Asia, that the population plummeted to a mere 4 million. But imagine a country the size of a continent with fewer people than a small city. There weren't enough people to build a strong economy or defend against invaders during war times. So, when World War II came knocking on Australia's door, the country wasn't prepared. Japan entered the Second World War in 1941 and quickly occupied Southeast Asia and the Pacific, getting dangerously close to Australia. And oh boy, Japan had its sights set on Australia. Japan was worried the United States might use Darwin as a launch pad for an airstrike on Asia, so they got ahead and bombed this little town first. The bombing of Darwin was the first time a foreign enemy struck Australian soil, killing over 240 soldiers. To this day, it remains the largest and the most brutal attack the country has ever faced. Imagine being an Aussie back then, watching London and other British cities getting bombed during World War II and thinking, are we next? Aussies were about to have their own blitz in their backyard, and there was no one to defend it, because the Brits were busy fighting their own battles against the Nazis in Europe. And Australia, of course, didn't have enough manpower to protect itself. The war laid bare Australia's vulnerability due to its sparse population. But, luckily for Australia, Japan surrendered in 1945, and the threat to Australia was finally over. Still, this was a huge wake-up call for Australia. It was time to populate or perish. The call went out loud and clear.
Without immigration, as a nation, we shall not survive.
The government went on a mission to repopulate Australia. The preference was still for white British, so the government offered them a sweet deal. Come over for only £10. And hey, kids travel free. It was an invitation to start fresh and build a new life after the war. Initially, the plan was a success. Thousands of Brits migrated to Australia in those early years. But let's face it, it wasn't going to meet the ambitious migrant target from white Brits alone. So in 1947, Australia decided to cast the net wider and accept immigrants from outside the British Isles.
These are the people we want, and the more of them, the better.
This was the first time the government offered incentives like free travel, housing subsidies, and employment assistance to non-white people. Thousands of immigrants flocked to Australia. Special programs were set up for displaced persons like Holocaust survivors and child migrants, such as orphans from Britain, offering them a new beginning in Australia. In return, all they had to do was declare their intention of becoming good Australians. As Australia became this hugely diverse country, it started to see more and more opposition to the White Australia policy. Came the 60s, you had a whole mix of folks, young people, migrants, and Aussies coming from all sorts of sectors of society saying the White Australia policy did not reflect who they were. Suddenly, you started to see arrivals from the Middle East, from Africa, from all across Europe, and from the Americas. Australia realized that immigrants contribute to the cosmopolitan feel of its major cities. They bring ideas with them, they bring skills, they bring talents, they bring economic benefits. The dreaded White Australia policy was abolished for good in 1975, less than 50 years ago. The government introduced the Racial Discrimination Act, and for the first time in 200 years, Australia had wiped its face clean of racism as far as the rule books were concerned, making it illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of lots of different characteristics, but particularly their race. Australia went from only white to a multicultural marvel. They pulled off one heck of a makeover in one of the greatest rebrands in world history. Fast forward to today, and Australia is buzzing with over 26 million people calling it home. With more than 1 in 4 Australians born overseas and 1 in 5 born to migrant parents, Australia is now a melting pot of cultures and languages. In Sydney, for example, at least 43% of the population were actually born overseas. So it could take you a while until you meet a real Sydney-sider, especially if you are living relatively close to the CBD. So keep this in mind if you're coming to Australia to practice your English. Depending on your suburb, you could be speaking more Mandarin, Arabic, Hindi, Spanish, or Greek. I'll leave a link to this interactive map in the description if you want to check your suburb. Before the pandemic, Australia received an average of 300,000 people on temporary visas and 200,000 permanent migrants each year. This all stopped during the pandemic. But last year, 2023, Australia received 550,000 temporary visa holders, although only 140,000 permanent visa holders. As you can see, the number of people moving permanently to Australia is still very low, and Australia continues its efforts to attract new permanent migrants to rev up the engine again. Whether they are properly planning for a huge wave of migration in the coming years, well, we'll see about that in the next video.